Some people rise from royalty, some rise from wealth, but some, like Jabez, rise from pain. His entire story is captured in only 2 verses. Yet those verses shook heaven, reshaped his destiny, and left behind one of the most powerful prayers in Scripture. Jabez proves that your beginning does not define your ending, and that one bold cry too. God can rewrite your entire life. If you love deep, faith-filled Bible stories told with heart and spiritual insight, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what God is revealing through these timeless narratives. Now let's begin the journey of Jabez. His story does not begin with triumph. It does not begin with blessing, honor, or promise. It begins with pain, literally. In a long genealogy tucked inside 1 Chronicles 4:9, one name unexpectedly interrupts the list. It reads, Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. His mother named him Jabez, saying, I gave birth to him in pain. In ancient Israel, names carried destiny. They were spoken with intention, believed to shape a child's future. So, when Jabez's mother cried out in agony and named her son after her suffering, the label clung to him. His very identity declared sorrow. His life began under a cloud of hardship, one he did not choose, yet one he could not escape. Imagine growing up with a name that literally meant pain. Imagine children whispering it, teachers calling it out, and family members remembering the hardship of his birth every time they spoke it. Yet Scripture hints at something unexpected. Though marked by sorrow, Jabez carried a different spirit within him. The verse begins with an unusual statement. Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. The Bible doesn't say he was stronger, wealthier, or more talented, only that he carried honor, a quality of character that stood out in God's eyes. Honor in Scripture speaks of integrity, reverence, humility, and alignment with God's ways. Jabez possessed something inward that contradicted the negativity spoken over him. His circumstances declared limitation, but his heart whispered possibility. Still, we must not imagine his journey as easy. Growing up with a label of pain likely meant rejection, misunderstanding, and perhaps the absence of a father figure. Many scholars suggest his mother may have been alone. Yet Jabez didn't turn bitter. He didn't accept the limitations spoken over him. Somewhere in the quiet places of his life, he developed a deep awareness of God, a belief that the Lord of Israel could lift him above what life had handed him. Jabez's story reminds us that pain does not disqualify us from purpose. Some destinies are forged in adversity, strengthened by struggle, and revealed through prayer. Though his mother's cry defined his name, it would not define his future. What sets Jabez apart is not how his life started, but what he eventually did with his sorrow. Instead of allowing pain to shape him, he would one day lift his voice to the God who heals, restores, and enlarges. But before that moment, Jabez lived with the tension of who he was told he was and who he sensed. God calling him to be. That inner struggle is where many believers find themselves, today born into circumstances they did not choose, carrying labels they did not deserve, wrestling silently with wounds the world cannot see. Yet Jabez stands as a quiet testimony that God can take the most painful beginnings and transform them into powerful destinies. His name was pain, his life was limitation, but his story was far from over. The boy marked by sorrow would soon become a man defined by prayer, a man heaven could not ignore. Jabez grew up with a name that reminded everyone of hardship. But what Scripture reveals next is subtle yet profound. Pain did not shape his character. Instead, it refined it. The same verse that mentions his difficult beginnings also declares that he was more honorable than his brothers. This simple statement hints at a quiet transformation that happened long before his famous prayer ever reached heaven. Honor is not inherited. It is cultivated, and for Jabez, it was forged in a lifetime of choosing God over bitterness. Though labeled by sorrow, he did not live by sorrow. While others may have carried pride, envy, or complacency, Jabez developed a heart that sought what pleased God. He learned early that circumstances do not determine destiny. Choices do, and Jabez chose righteousness. We are not told much about his family, yet The contrast in the text suggests that Jabez lived differently from those around him. Perhaps his brothers accepted the patterns of their community, anger, division, and fear. But Jabez, having grown up with a painful reminder engraved into his identity, refused to repeat the cycles that bound others. His name might have meant pain, but his conduct revealed perseverance. Honor is developed when no one sees. It is built through quiet acts of obedience, the unseen decisions to walk in humility, and the small sacrifices that align a life with God's heart. Jabez's honor likely grew through simple, everyday faithfulness. When others cut corners, he chose integrity. When others sought revenge, he pursued peace. When others worshipped idols, he remained loyal to the God of Israel. Deep within him, something stirred, a holy dissatisfaction with living beneath the weight of his name. He knew the God of Israel was not limited by human labels, nor bound by earthly expectations. Jabez began to rise internally long before God expanded anything externally. Many in Israel recited prayers out of tradition, but Jabez began to pray out of conviction. He believed that God cared not only about nations, but about individuals, about men like him who carried invisible burdens. There must have been nights when he looked at the stars and whispered, "Lord, I know you are more than what my life currently is. I know you can do more than what I've experienced. Show yourself in my story." His upbringing may have included whispers, sideways glances, and societal limitation. Yet rather than breaking him, these pressures deepened his spiritual hunger. Pain sensitized him to the presence of God. Hardship taught him dependence. Limitations taught him faith. While others had comfort, ease, and ordinary expectations, Jabez had a holy longing, and longing is often the birthplace of breakthrough. Before Jabez ever prayed his famous words, he had already separated himself through character. His desire for God made him noticeable in heaven, even if he remained invisible on earth. And though his name was tied to sorrow, his life was being shaped by hope. Honorable people are often those who refuse to allow their suffering to turn them against God. Jabez understood that his past was not his enemy. Disconnection from God was. So he leaned into the one who could transform his narrative. There is no record that Jabez fought battles, ruled territories, or built monuments. His greatness was not in public accomplishments, but in private devotion. He lived quietly, faithfully, and intentionally until one decisive moment, when his internal rise became an outward request. Jabez was ready for more. He was ready to step beyond what life had spoken over him and into what God desired to give him. Before he ever cried out, "Oh, that you would bless me indeed," he lived in such a way that heaven took notice. The man born into pain had become a man prepared for promise. Everything in Jabez's life led to a single, defining moment. The genealogy of 1 Chronicles marches through name after name, father, son, tribe, lineage, until suddenly the rhythm stops. Heaven pauses. The text breaks its pattern to reveal the cry of one man, a prayer so bold and so faith-filled that it changes the entire tone of the chapter. It says, Jabez cried out to the God of Israel. He didn't whisper. He didn't recite a memorized prayer. He cried out. This was not a moment of shallow hope. It was a moment of total surrender and deep belief. Jabez approached God not as a distant deity, but as the covenant-keeping Lord of Israel, faithful, powerful, attentive, and near. The God who parted seas, fed his people in the wilderness, and strengthened kings was the same God Jabez dared to petition. His words were simple yet profound. "Oh, that you would bless me indeed and enlarge my territory. Let your hand be with me, and keep me from harm, so that I will be free from pain." Each phrase carried weight. Each request revealed a different dimension of bold faith. Bless me indeed. Jabez was not asking for common favor. The word indeed intensified his plea. He was asking for God's unmistakable involvement in his life. This wasn't selfishness. It was surrender. He believed God's blessings were better than anything he could create on his own. He wanted nothing that didn't come from God's hand. Enlarge my territory. Territory represented influence, responsibility, opportunity, and impact. Jabez wasn't asking for wealth alone. He was asking for a larger assignment. He wanted God to expand his reach, his purpose, and his usefulness. A man once defined by limitation now dared to believe in divine expansion. Let your hand be with me. This is the heart of the prayer. Jabez understood that blessing without God becomes empty. Expansion without God becomes dangerous. He refused to take one step into new territory without the hand of God guiding him. Scripture consistently describes God's hand as a symbol of strength, protection, and empowerment. Jabez didn't just want more. He wanted God himself. Keep me from harm so that I will be free from pain. This final request is the most personal. Jabez, whose very name meant pain, asked God to rewrite his story, to break the cycle, to sever the curse, and to protect him from the suffering that once marked his identity. He wasn't running from hardship. He was running to the God who heals, restores, and preserves. It was a prayer of transformation, a prayer that refused to accept what life had called him, a prayer rooted not in entitlement, but in deep humility and trust in God's character. And then Scripture gives one of the most powerful responses in all of the Bible. And God granted his request. No hesitation, no conditions, no rebuke. Heaven heard the cry of a man with a painful past and a hopeful heart and answered him with favor. In that moment, Jabez shifted from sorrow to significance, from limitation to expansion, from being named for pain to being known for prayer. His life became proof that God is not limited by heritage, environment, circumstances, or labels. He is moved by faith. Jabez prayed what others were afraid to ask. He believed what others could not imagine, and God responded in full. The man once defined by pain had stepped into divine purpose. Jabez appears only briefly in Scripture, tucked between genealogies and lineages that span generations. No stories of battles, no accounts of royal decisions, no descriptions of wealth, status, or public leadership, just a name, a prayer, and a divine response. Yet that is precisely what makes his legacy so remarkable. In a book overflowing with historical detail, the Spirit of God paused to spotlight a man defined not by his lineage, but by his faith. The chronicler could have simply listed him and moved on, as he did with countless others. But Jabez's cry to God was too significant to ignore. Heaven heard it, Scripture recorded it, and generations have been shaped by it. Jabez's story teaches us something profound. God does not measure greatness by length, visibility, or earthly accomplishment. He measures it by the heart that seeks him. His life is not remembered because of who his parents were or the tribe he came from. In fact, his genealogy is overshadowed by the meaning of his name. Yet Jabez refused to let pain have the final word. By turning to God in bold, unfiltered prayer, he carved his legacy out of faith rather than circumstance. What stands out most is the simplicity of the biblical record. Chronicles 4:10 preserves the entire legacy in a single line, and God granted his request. This short sentence is one of the most powerful endorsements. In all of Scripture, God himself put his stamp of approval on Jabez's heart, his prayer, and his posture toward heaven. In a world full of noise, this kind of clarity is rare. Jabez's legacy is not about the specifics of what expanded or what blessings followed. Scripture withholds those details. So we are not distracted by the outcome. The focus remains on the relationship, a man who dared to pray and a God who delighted to answer. By leaving the results undescribed, the Bible invites every believer to place themselves in Jabez's sandals, to pray as he prayed, and to trust God with the form the blessing takes. And that is part of his brilliance. His story is universal. Anyone from any background, any struggle, or any past can pray like Jabez. His life stands as a reminder that there are no barriers too great, no labels too heavy, and no circumstances too confining for God to break through. We learn from Jabez that a single moment of faith can outweigh a lifetime of limitation. In generations to come, rabbis, teachers, and believers would speak of Jabez not as a man of power, but as a man of prayer. His legacy is spiritual, not historical, transformational, not temporal. His influence is felt not through works recorded, but through the faith he modeled so clearly. His story also reveals the beauty of God's character. Jabez prayed boldly because he trusted that the God of Israel was generous, protective, attentive, and capable of shaping his life beyond human expectations. The fact that God answered him confirms that such trust was well placed, and so the life of Jabez teaches us a simple but life-altering truth. Heaven responds to the heart that dares to believe. God for more, not out of greed, not out of pride, but out of a desire to walk in the fullness of God's will. Jabez disappears from Scripture as suddenly as he appears, but his prayer remains echoing across time, inviting believers in every century to lift their own voices. Boldly, bless me indeed, enlarge my territory. Let your hand be with me, keep me from harm. And the God who answered Jabez is the same today. His story may be short, but his impact is eternal. Jabez reminds us that we are never trapped by the circumstances we inherit. A painful beginning does not dictate a painful future. His life proves that when a person turns to God with sincerity and expectation, heaven leans in, listens, and responds. This is the power of prayer, rooted in belief, the kind that moves beyond survival and reaches for purpose. Jabez's legacy is not found in earthly accomplishments, but in the spiritual truth his story reveals. God honors those who seek him wholeheartedly. His life shows that divine favor flows freely to those who refuse to settle for limitation and instead ask God to shape their destiny. And so, though his name was tied to sorrow, his legacy is tied to hope. Jabez stepped into a new identity, not by changing his name, but by changing his posture toward God. That is why his story still speaks, still inspires, and still challenges us today. If the story of Jabez stirred something in your heart, if it reminded you that God still answers bold prayers, and if it encouraged you to believe again for what seems impossible, subscribe to our channel for more powerful Bible stories brought to life with depth and faith. Comment below what part of Jabez's journey encourages you most. His courage to ask, his faith to believe, or God's willingness to answer. Share this video with someone who needs the reminder that God can rewrite any story. Because like Jabez, your future is not defined by your beginning,